I hear you, Tolkien nerds. Relax. I understand that the One Ring is the font of all evil in Middle-earth, and without it Sauron could never rise to threaten the world again. And yes, I'm also aware that no one but Sauron can actually use the ring at all, since it calls nobody but him master, and so there's literally no reason not to destroy it in the context of the actual Lord of the Rings story. But that's not what this video is going to be about. I only gave it that title because if I'd called it something more esoteric, like the One Ring is a flimsy metaphor for evil, nobody but the 36 Tolkien hyper-nerds left on Earth who have both the time and mind to read whole books would have clicked on that. And the real point I wanted to make is that the whole philosophy behind the One Ring in concept, this idea that good people shouldn't crave power, is either completely unactionable from a real-world perspective at best, or at worst it's completely back-asswards, since if the good person puts down their sword, the tool that gives them power, and the evil person doesn't, then the evil person will be the one who rules the world, since they'll have a sword and you won't. So in essence, Tolkien's conception of good is of a person who voluntarily forfeits the world to the clutches of evil. But I'm getting ahead of myself as usual. Contrary to how that little rant may have made it sound, I have a profound respect for Professor Tolkien, his works, and his genius. In my estimation, he's one of the greatest writers of all time and deserves to be recognized as such. However, the reason why I say the One Ring doesn't work as a metaphor is because in real life, solving the egotistical quest for power is not nearly so simple as casting it into the fire, as even knowledge of its prior existence will still cause people to hunt and claw for its return. Similar to how the Death Eaters worked to revive Voldemort, the cult of the dragon tried to bring back Tiamat, the cult of Cthulhu tried to summon the old ones into our real space, and of course there's the innumerable Chaos and Gene Stealer cults in 40K who worship the Dark Gods and Tyrannid Hivemind, respectively. And while those groups may mostly be driven on by what Lovecraft described as a most peculiar kind of madness, let's not forget the veritable legions of ancient doomsday weapons, forbidden lore, or mystic artifacts that have been safely lost to time or locked away, only to then be rediscovered by some megalomaniacal maniac with delusions of grandeur and an ego that couldn't fit within the circumference of most local star clusters. The same is true with technology of all kinds IRL. Take the atom bomb, for instance. Even if you could, Thanos snap away every single nuclear bomb on the planet, as well as all the facilities and technical knowledge needed to make them, unless you also sent to oblivion every single person who'd so much as heard of a city-destroying bomb before. Sooner or later, you'd have government scientists scrambling to resurrect the concept, because each would know that if their enemies ever got a weapon that could level cities in a single punch before they did, they would be on the losing end of any future conflict. The same is true nowadays for AI. It's why both the US and Soviet Union put real, genuine efforts into exploring the paranormal back during the Cold War. And it's why you know that if the magic Sauron used to create the One Ring hadn't gone out of the world with the elves, at some point some dipshit human ruler, probably some future incarnation of this guy, would have heard some rumors of tales of this magical ring that could make its wearer the immortal king of the universe, and thought, I want one, then put all of their resources into prying the secret from the cosmos' cold, dead fingers. Sure, if the source of your power is a one-off item that can't be duplicated, like a wand literally hand-forged by death itself to be the deadliest thing in existence, or a sword made by the gods, or a set of magical stones wrought in the furnace at the beginning of all time and space, by all means, huck that shit into the volcano or the ocean or whatever and let's have rid of it. But if even the tiniest slimmer of a glint of an iota of a possibility exists that somehow this power font could be replicated, you can feel sure betting any amount of money that the powers that be won't rest until they're its sole possessors and proprietors, as holding the keys to power is always just as lucrative as having the power itself. And this has always been my greatest point of contention with Christianity, which I bring up because Tolkien was a devout Catholic. The fact that their greatest virtue is to sanctimoniously, and often witlessly, actively promote the banality of evil. To quote the coiner of the phrase, Hannah Arendt herself, this inability to think created the possibility for many ordinary men to commit evil deeds on a gigantic scale, the like of which had never been seen before. Or to use a more famous quote that's frequently attributed to Hannah Arendt, but which actually came to us from the 16th century philosopher Edmund Burke. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. And in case that's not enough for you, in Luke 22:36, Jesus Christ himself said, He that hath no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one. And again, in Matthew 10:34 and 35, he says this, Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. I could go on, but you get the point. This isn't a pure Tolkienian invention, of course, nor is it even uniquely Christian, but it is pervasive enough in our modern slave moralist culture that most people still never so much as think to question it. Even Parthenax, with his most famous line about overcoming your evil nature through great effort, wrongfully conflates the natural desire for power, which just means the ability to do, with a perverse hunger to use it to destructively dominate and enslave everyone and everything around you. But this much has already been fairly well documented and discussed, and in itself therefore exists beyond the stated purview scope of my channel. However, the novel, as far as I'm aware, point I'm angling towards with this script is that the idea the One Ring ultimately symbolizes, the corrupting nature of power and its voluntary relinquishment for the greater good, is unactionable, because that's not how power works outside the bounds of fantasy. In short, power doesn't corrupt, it enables. A genuinely kind, righteous, and noble person doesn't magically become the Lich King just because you put a fancy sword in their hand. It's the same backward style of magical thinking that leads swarms of pea-brained ivory tower aristocrats and their sophistic armies of petty ordophiles to think that gun control is a valid solution to gun crime, which works us right around to my opening point. As illustrated by Philip Ludi's hardware store SMG project, the only way to truly, meaningfully affect and sort of disarmament campaign upon a society is to not only systematically delete all instances of the offending power tools, but also all existing articles and vessels of knowledge about them from the popular consciousness, which works about as well as trying to remove salt from your soup without compromising the flavor. But you might be thinking right about now that this all seems like an unusually well-worn path for me to be tracing. After all, a little-known German man with a majestic mustache, pretty thoroughly laid, paved and traveled these same roads over a century ago. So what gives? Well, if I'm being completely honest, all that preamble stuff about magic rings and evil kings was all just an elaborate setup for me to rant about this whole unfurling debacle about a certain Schrodinger's naughty list belonging to an allegedly very bad and now mysteriously dead man. The reason for all the smoke and mirrors is because I know YouTube would bury this video so deep in the sand that Satan could hear the ocean in it if I'd led with that. Now, I know you probably wouldn't have guessed it given that not much of my real personality comes through an AI audio filter, but after years spent in the mire of the radical acceptance, stoic philosophy, black pill, grimdark Tao, or whatever else you want to call it, there aren't many things left in this world that make me legitimately angry. This is one of those last remaining redoubts of rage bait that I can't quite seem to summit. And honestly, the sole reason for that is because it simply confirms what I think we've all known for a long time, but that most of us preferred not to acknowledge, or were holding out some hope that maybe it wasn't true, that we really were just crazy conspiracy nuts, that the powers that be truly are untouchable, that the rich and powerful can do whatever they want when they want with impunity, that they could kill a nun in town square at high noon, and the worst that would happen is they'd get a slap on the wrist and a theatrical finger wagging. How this relates to the Lord of the Rings is that, while I was passively watching Tim Pool's segment on the subject, he specifically referred to the Blacklist, as I'm going to call it for the ears of the YouTube bots, as the Deep State's One Ring, which, if the major conspiracy hypothesis I've heard floating around for why the Blacklist hasn't been released yet is even somewhat true to life, it's actually a more appropriate analogy than Tim realizes. If you only know the story from the movies, you'll likely be a bit fuzzy on just what exactly the Rings of Power actually do. The way their magics work is that they both grow and sustain that which the wearer loves most. For the 9 men, this was their lives, extending and stretching them so far they turned into undead wraiths. For the dwarf lords, it was their treasure, causing them to dig too greedily and too deep, waking the Balrog and attracting the dragon to their hoard. And for the elves, it was their realms, namely Rivendell and Lothlorien. The problem is that the powers of the other 19 rings are all bound to that of the One Ring itself, meaning that if it's destroyed, their powers, and by extension everything the Rings of Power were preserving well beyond their allotted lifespan, would die out along with it. This is why the elves are so sullen and somber throughout the story. They know that, for the good of the world, the One Ring needs to be destroyed, but they also know what it's going to cost. This is an exceedingly important point of the Lord of the Rings story, and it's one of the very few major gripes I have with Peter Jackson's trilogy, as it showcases the supreme nobility, honor, and wisdom of the elven race. To be willing to watch their realms of light and joy dwindle to ash and shade so that everything else may live in peace. And so now, the question I wanted to use this as a vehicle to ask and give my own personal answer to is this. If you had that list in your hands right now, would you release it? Before you answer, consider carefully the repercussions. Imagine what it could do to the economy, to the country, to the world order as we or anyone else presently living has ever known if it turns out the roots of this evil web trace as deep as many have speculated? Would you burn the whole world down, with you in it, in order to purge it of this infected rot? Would you unleash the fires of chaos just to cleanse the sacred tyranny? Would you shatter the dynamos of fate itself to unseat a parasitic false god? Would you kill the entire galaxy to starve the flood? Let me know your answers below. As for me, well, as far as I'm concerned, any form of order which depends on cruelty, tyranny, oppression, lies, and deceit in order to sustain itself has no right to exist. Or maybe I'm just being hopelessly naive. Again, let me know what you think down in the comments. Also, you'll notice I'm using the word evil a lot in this episode, which, if you know me or my thoughts in that regard, you'll know is not a word I toss out like candy. My reasons for unsheathing it now are threefold. 1, because I consider the sacred order, as in a tyrannical regime whose pretenses of their greater works are merely a facade to mask their true vampiric natures in all its forms and all of the derivative facets, to be the most obscene plague ever to blight humanity. 2, because if the powers that be are willing to withhold information of this particular nature from you, it doesn't take a particularly active imagination to wonder about what other horrors they're keeping locked within their deus vaults. And number 3, because the single most potent killer for any society is hypocrisy, by which is meant, in this context, a noticeable disconnect between the approved narrative and actual lived observation and experience. In other words, when what you're seeing and what you're being told about the world you actually live in don't match, it kills the ability of the ordinary thinking person to have trust or faith in the system which rules them and which supposedly works to further their collective interests. But before I work myself up into an hour-long tangent over yon hills and plains, I'm going to just cut myself off and remind you to like and subscribe. Join me over on Patreon, Discord, Rumble, Odyssey, or X. Check out my merch store or Amazon library. And until such time as I see you again, my friends, as always, stay safe, stay sane, and remember,
the Force will be with you, always.